We are super excited to finally have Patrick Traynor from Georgia Tech. Patrick is an assistant professor currently, but his tenure file is in, so wish him luck. In the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. He got his PhD in 2008 from Penn State University under another Patrick McDaniel, and he tells me he does not yet have his own PhD student named Patrick, so if your name is Patrick, this may be an opportunity.
It's true. Always looking for a P3. I'm P2, by the way. So.
Okay, so today Patrick will be talking to us about security and privacy in mobile phones and mobile networks. So let's welcome Patrick.
So thanks so much for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to finally be here in Waterloo. I want to tell you about some of the work we've been doing over the past few years in roughly telecommunications security at Georgia Tech. But first, I want to tell you why it's really great to be a professor. Okay? So, a couple of months ago, I stormed into my lab and I said, stop whatever you are doing, drop it, and I want you, to all my students, for the next 30 minutes, go out, scour the internet, find absolutely the most ridiculous thing you can find in a news article, and report back to me. Turned around, walked out, slammed the door. Showed up half an hour later, here's what I got. And some of this, folks, I'm going to admit, it's frightening. You see, it turns out that Bigfoot sightings are common in Ohio. Now, I know we're not terribly close. We've got a little body of water between us, but boy, that's close enough. What else? Okay. It's not just our side of the pond. It turns out that reliable reports indicate that the Loch Ness Monster is real. It's absolutely real. Okay. If you're from, say, the Southern California area, you might be disturbed to know that the chupacabra hangs out on the beach there, so you may want to be careful. And my personal favorite, it turns out that the bat boy is alive and well. Alive and well. Now, we can all laugh at this because we're scientists. And we realize that these are absolutely extraordinary claims. And in order for us to verify extraordinary claims, we demand extraordinary data. Right? All right, we're all on the same page. So then I said to my students, okay, now what I want you to do is go and find some claims that are maybe a little bit more believable and relevant to your research. So here's what they came back with. Okay. Mobile malware attacks on the rise. That certainly seems more reasonable than the bat boy, right? I mean, now all of us have mobile devices. They're incredibly powerful. They can do everything. People say that this is the computing device for the average person on the planet going forward. So yeah, I could imagine that someone might want to attack that. That sounds reasonable. Okay. Okay, it turns out someone that we might trust says the same thing. Okay? Someone who's in this business says, you know, we're actually noticing this trend as well. And by the way, I'm a scientist, so I have one data point. I now have two data points. I have a line between them. Okay? I'm noticing a trend. Okay? 2 data points is more than enough if you have a PhD, by the way. I kid. But it looks like Android is the only one that's affected until we go to our third point here. And it turns out that, boy, this sounds a little like a threat, doesn't it? Maybe iOS isn't as secure as everyone would like. We know Android's bad because we have 2 data points, right? Okay, now we have 1, but again, we all know 2 is greater than 1, so iOS is probably fine. Uh-oh. Now we're tied. Things are starting to look bad all around. Okay? In fact, they might be getting worse for Apple. Okay, so maybe they're okay now, but the trends are all going badly. Here's where things start to get frightening. 6 mobile malware trends for 2012. What does this mean? It means that things are already so bad that we have to distill them down into 6 trends. There's so much bad stuff going on that we have to talk about it in 6 high-level things. That's frightening. Android malware infections increased by 700%. Could you imagine if this was the flu? I mean, how many people in here would be here, yet alone alive? 700%. This is awful. This is awful. And you know what? Here's my personal favorite. Android has become the ultimate malware platform. Now, take a step back, because this is a press headline, and I want you to realize the implication here. Everyone remember how bad Windows 98 was? Okay. How many of you have ever written a buffer overflow exploit for Windows 98? You should go back and do it. It's really easy. Okay. But guess what? As bad as that was, this is worse. It's worse. It's over. You know what? I'm going to leave my phone over there. I'm going to walk over here because the game is over. Why do we even bother to have these devices at all? It's frightening, isn't it? Except something's nagging me, I got to say. This is all well and good, but, all right, show of hands. Now I'm going to ask a very specific question, and I require an exact answer. How many of you have actually been infected with mobile malware? Now I don't mean you downloaded a program that you don't like. I mean, how many of you actually got a piece of mobile malware on your phone that everyone in the AV industry would agree, that's mobile malware? Oh, none. Well, you know, the problem is that I took a lot of math classes. My stats professors would be furious with me because my sample size is too small, and you guys are too smart. Right? This is a security group, so of course you haven't. But do you know anybody? Okay. Well, that's because you all run antivirus software. So show of hands, how many people have AV software running on their phone? One. All right. Well, we can explain one. What about the rest of you? Okay, well, how many of you would run it on your phone if I told you I'd give it away for free? Huh. Okay. Maybe some of you are laughing at me still. How many of you say, look, I own an Apple device, and quite frankly, these are the problems of the commoners. Why should I bother to consider mobile malware? Why, we can't be touched over here in Apple land. Okay, now, this one I imagine that hands are down because people are probably shaking their heads, but they don't want to be called out. So you can keep that answer to yourself. More importantly, is this the most important problem? I mean, given our sample size, I'm not seeing a lot of people who are being affected. Yet, much of the research in this space has been focused on exactly this problem. And much of the press in this space has been focused on exactly this problem. So, are we spending our time well? I don't know. So, that's part of what my talk is today. The first half is, what's the reality of malicious behavior in mobile networks? How bad is it? What does 700% mean? And by the way, how was that measured? Actually, I don't have an answer for that question, but I have some good guesses. You'll find it's not very well. Okay. In particular, I want to know how many people actually install malicious mobile applications. Now, I'm going to wear handcuffs here a little bit. How do I define malicious mobile application? I'm going to punt. And what I'm going to punt to is things that people who are better deciders of what morality is than I am. The AV vendors, other researchers in the field who have ripped this stuff apart, and everyone agrees that's malware. Okay, now, why do I do that? Well, some of you may have a problem with the way that apps operate currently. So there's a study done by a good friend of mine in 2011. It showed that at that time, 50% of free apps had ad libraries, many of them multiple ad libraries, and 50% of those apps asked for, say, your GPS information. So I want to answer a very simple question. You get this semester to do research in mobile security, and I'm telling you that roughly 25% of the applications that are popular are taking your data and just stealing it. And that's just GPS data. I'm also telling you this mobile malware thing, which sounds really, really bad, but I don't know how bad it is. So where should you spend your time between these two things? Where should you spend your resources? Okay? And the reference for this is going to be a paper that we published at NDSS last year. The second half of the talk, I'm going to ask about other problems. Yeah, it turns out that there are other things that are wrong and broken in telephony. In particular, there's a growing presence of wire fraud enabled by VoIP. And I'm going to look at whether or not it's possible to develop a robust authenticator for phone calls. Okay? The source material for this work comes from a 2010 paper that we had at CCS. And at the end of the talk, I'll tell you why you should care about a paper that showed up almost 4 years ago. All right, so let's start off. So if I build a piece of malware for a mobile device and no one downloads it, should we care? Right? It's the old, if a tree falls in the forest. Okay? Well, the community has been very, very good about this. We've gone out and we've found lots of pieces. We find them in markets. We can find software that does all sorts of stuff. It roots phones when you don't expect it. It tries to steal private information that other apps just ask you for and take anyway. And so those are malicious. But if no one's downloading it, is it really that big of a deal? So we want to build on some of the research that others have done by analyzing specific pieces of malware, by analyzing markets, and figure out what the hole is. And that is, in situ, in real systems, how many people are getting infected? How many people are actually finding these obscure applications in Chinese or Russian or even the main Google market and installing them? And the reason for this is simple. The reason for this exploration is, my parents came to me and said, Patrick, should we buy antivirus software for our phones? And intuitively, I wanted to say, sure, it makes sense. I bet you have all kinds of valuable data there. But as a scientist, I couldn't give them a good reason either way. So that's how we did it. Or that's why we did it. In particular, what we need to do is we need to look at the traffic that's in mobile networks and figure out, based on that, what people have installed. OK, so the way we do this is as follows. We're going to do a really large passive DNS analysis. And in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to install ourselves inside a major cellular ISP in the United States. And we're going to sit just below the DNS resolver. So we're going to see every single request made within this network, within this portion of this network, for DNS addresses. And then we're going to use techniques that have been used by the security community for quite some time to analyze where people are going. Now, our hypothesis is simple. Like traditional malware, mobile malware is going to use DNS. And we can prove that by cracking it open and looking at it. We see that it does. And that the patterns are going to be observable in our analysis. Okay, so we can look at domains, number one, that we can find from inside pieces of mobile malware. And then we can also potentially take historical data about known malicious domains and see whether or not people in mobile networks are reaching out to those too. Okay, again, it looks like this. Let's pretend that you have we'll call it Moogle Maps. All right? And Moogle Maps, of course, is a one-off. And it gives you this wonderful mapping and navigation service. And what it does is it calls a premium SMS number. It sends a premium SMS. Every time this app does that, you get charged 99 cents. Now, before it does this, it turns out that it also does a couple of DNS resolutions. The first, it's something expected. It goes to maps.google.com. We don't think that's malicious. But maybe accesses to bad.evil.com are malicious. If this thing is classified as malicious, we can look at those domains. And again, based on historical evidence, we can figure out which of these are potentially malicious. The reason, by the way, that we have this DNS hit when we're doing strictly an SMS request is that the bad guys want to figure out, hey, are we still using this number? Right? Has our premium SMS number been shut down? Yes or no? And so this will inform what the number is here. Okay, so we want to see this in our passive DNS traffic. And by cracking open applications and seeing this, then we know whether or not people have that application installed. Now, of course, bad.evil.com is a gross simplification, but we can extract domains easily from the applications. Now, this process is the most intense analysis of data that I've ever done. It was hundreds of terabytes of information. And it was collected, again, from a major cellular ISP in the United States. Unfortunately, I can't say which one it was. But if you're in the US, roughly half the population uses it. So this wasn't a fly-by-night kind of company. It wasn't something that was very custom. This is very representative of what cellular systems in the US, and we like to think beyond, look like. OK, so because we were getting many terabytes per day, we had to find a way to cut through this data and slice it up so that we could even reason about it. Right, so we're going to do a couple of things. The first we're going to do is segment our traffic into mobile and non-mobile. Hold on, that sounds a little crazy, right? If I'm going through a cellular provider, isn't it all mobile phones? It turns out it's not. So for those of you who aren't familiar, a lot of mobile phone providers also provide backhaul service for, say, Wi-Fi hotspots at cafes, etc. Mobile providers also often offer these USB dongles. I'm sure some of you are familiar with them. You plug in your laptop can go over cellular. So we need some way to be able to say, look, we can say that these devices are definitely mobile, and these ones are not, or there's likely some uncertainty. So we only want to reason about traffic that we're certain is mobile. Once we cut it down to mobile, we're going to classify it in 3 different categories, and that is benign, malicious, and unknown. Okay, and we'll find interesting stuff in each of these spaces. I'm going to very briefly go over the methodology here. There's lots and lots more in the paper if you're interested in how you actually munch this data. But it was quite a difficult process. First thing we do, though, is we try and identify mobile devices. And again, we're constrained in that we can only look at DNS information that's being resolved from them. So how can we tell whether or not a device is mobile? Well, it turns out that there are telltale signs in the DNS requests from the devices. In particular, we look for mobile-specific strings that represent mobile-specific domains. So some of the common ones I'm sure you're familiar with, m.example.com or mobile.example.com, android.iphone.ipad touch. Believe it or not, we even found the famous star.mobi. Anyone remember what Mobi was supposed to be about? It's supposed to be this TLD, strictly for mobile stuff. This actually represented far less than 1% of all the domains that people resolved. So perhaps we can debate, but the .mobi thing really hasn't panned out, at least that far. But we did look for it. Things we cannot see. Okay? If you specify that a mobile site is example.com/mobile, we can't see that request. That request means nothing to us because that's an application layer request and not something that will show up in DNS. So if you're only going to sites that look like this, we'll miss you as a mobile device. All right? OK. I want to go into the data set. I promise I won't make you read all these numbers. There are 2 that are important. I'm going to go ahead and highlight them. And I'm going to tell you why. And there's a larger conversation here. The first is that over the course of these 3 weeks and 3 separate months, you see we have April, May, and June, and 1 week in each of those. We found there were a total of about 15 million unique domains that were resolved in this network at this time. And we also saw a total of 380.5 million unique devices. Now hold on a second. This is in the United States. The population is roughly 300 million. How on earth did we get 380 million devices? Well, we learned something really interesting about the provider network, and that was that NAT is alive and very, very well in real provider networks. And the extent to which this network was natted was startling. Okay? But it also worked out for the privacy concerned in the room in many ways. And that is, on any given day, we were given an algorithm by which we could map a set of ports, a subset of ports, and an IP address to a specific device. But across days, we could not map 2 devices to each other. So this 380 million devices is technically possible, but really what it represents is about 20 million devices using this resolver, 20 to 21 million devices each day, and they look new. Okay, so reasons that it's good that we couldn't see all of this data and track users across days. Well, I'm at a privacy forum, so I guess I'm sure you can bet. Number 1, there are legal reasons. In the US, allegedly, it is highly illegal to give out information about individual user patterns, but that's largely in relation to phone calls. Okay, so we didn't have any access to actual phone numbers that were dialed. We got none of that. And again, that all falls under wiretapping statutes. And the second is under NDA, we had to make certain promises about the kinds of things that we would do to the data. So we made absolutely no efforts to try and identify a user across days. So I'll have some data for you in a little while that shows you the highlights at each day. But this is an absolute maximum. Our estimate is about 20 to 22 million devices a day, and that's roughly corroborated by the provider. OK, so what did we see? Right, for all of this fuss, what kinds of things did we see? Well, the first cool result is the following, that the mobile web is the web, which sounds profound, and yet not. What does it mean? Well, it turns out that when we took all of the domains that were resolved and all the hosts that were resolved during this time period in the mobile provider, and then we went to a traditional ISP, and we looked at, over the last 18 months, which domains and hosts have we seen? Almost 99% of those domains and hosts were also seen in a traditional wired ISP. Why is that good news? Well, it turns out that all the reputation information we've gathered about domains and hosts in past security studies in the space, that's all going to be useful again in the mobile space. So even if something, say, hasn't been classified as malware yet, we might be able to say, there's a program reaching out to these domains that we know are part of the Zeus Botnet. Why on earth is this piece of software still on the market? Okay? So again, the great advantage here is that we can reuse all of that reputation information and then apply it to this space. So then once we had mobile only, what we wanted to do is cut up that data into malicious, benign, and unknown. And so we had a couple of different lists. Now again, if you work in this space, this is a little more meaningful. I apologize if you don't. For the mobile malware, the first question we want to answer was, how much of it is out there? And so we actually went to 3 different sources to answer that question. The first was something called ZOW. It ended up being an SOK paper at Oakland 2011, I think. They have the biggest academic database of mobile malware. And so we grabbed all of that from them. The other is a public repository called Contagio. And Contagio is another repository. It's got some different stuff. There's a lot of overlap. And the third is that we actually went out to an AV vendor who asked, again, that they remain unnamed. And we said, listen, give us all the domains you've extracted from mobile malware. We're doing a search to see how much is out there. So they gave us their list as well. All right, so our hope was with this, the most comprehensive list of domains and hosts being resolved by mobile malware, we could see what was out there. We also wanted to look for known bad stuff. So we went to public blacklists, to URL lists, MD5 lists, lists of hosts being resolved by known malware. We got one of the largest collections of those lists possible and searched through the data for hits to that. And that data lets us answer 2 questions. And those are, first, do phones talk to domains associated with mobile malware? And number 2, which phones talk to suspicious domains in general? So let's answer that question. So ladies and gentlemen, I have bad news for you. And that, first of all, is that mobile malware is real. Okay, it's absolutely real. It's not just software that no one downloads. So when we look at devices of any type, when we throw out this mobile versus non-mobile distinction, to be comprehensive, you can see that we see a pretty large number, right? I mean, 5,000 devices, 2,000 devices. We cut it down to mobile, still pretty large numbers, right? 2,145 devices appear to be infected with fake doc. But what I want to do is put this into context. What do these numbers mean? Okay, well, in terms of the number of devices we actually saw, these numbers represent less than 1/11,000th of 1% of the devices that we saw in the network. So for context, you're far, far more likely to be struck by lightning over the course of your lifetime than you were to be infected with mobile malware during the period of our analysis. That's a somewhat different message than we've been getting in those reports, isn't it? Okay, well, let's look at some other numbers. Again, I noted that we had this problem across days. We couldn't track devices, and so what did infection look like on any given day? And this lower line is the one that we're confident in because this is mobile only. And we see is that across any given day, that on average about 166 out of the 21 to 22 million devices observed were infected with something. Okay? And we got up as high as 219 and as low as 57. And by the way, just a question I like to ask as I go around and give this talk. Anybody know anything that happened on June 22nd or happens annually on June 22nd? We sort of joke that this was a Friday, and we think that most of the graduate students in North America who were doing mobile malware research, and probably the ones who have their devices infected, took that Friday off. So all the numbers tumbled. And then when they came back to work, you can see a few days later into the lab, the numbers recovered. 166 devices on average out of 21 to 22 million. These are frightfully small numbers. But there were some other cool observations as well. All right, so the next thing we did was we chopped the data up, and we wanted to figure out who's infected, right? Because all of those headlines I showed you demonstrated that, look, we know Android is terrible. We know Android is terrible, right? And Apple is fine, although it's being threatened by some people. But what did the numbers tell us? So the first column here looks at the total number of requests by device. And we split this up into iOS and all others. We have a breakdown roughly in we have more extensive numbers on other devices, but it roughly works out to you'll see even proportions. All these numbers here mean is the following: that roughly a third of the devices in this provider network were running iOS, and 2/3 were running something else. And we checked with the provider, and that was true. Now, how did we do this? Well, by DNS. Turns out that iOS devices go to very specific Apple subdomains, and we can see that in their DNS behavior. Okay? I'm going to bring up all of these. Here's the interesting thing. Here is the by volume requests to domains that not necessarily have anything to do with mobile malware, but requests that go to hosts that are known to be associated with malicious campaigns throughout the internet. And what we see is exactly, and I will not argue that this is statistically different from that, but almost exactly the same proportion of requests for malicious hosts come from iOS devices as everything else. The implication here is that users, regardless of their platform, seem to be going to domains of suspicious reputation with about the same frequency. Anyone have any guesses as to why? Yeah, we don't know either. We have a couple of hints, but what seems to be affecting users of all walks of life, of all types of device ownership equally? My guess, by the way, is probably phishing. And it probably comes from, if any of you ride a bus or any sort of public transit, watch what happens when people get bored around you. They break out their phones and they sit there and maybe they read emails that they usually wouldn't read. And maybe they click on links that they usually wouldn't click on. There are some studies to say that mobile users are more prone to phishing attacks. I think that this space is a little less mature than the traditional phishing space yet. So I can't give you definitive answers yet. We're actually trying to answer this now with more data and crawling immediately when these things are happening to give concrete results. But the answer right now is people in general, regardless of their device, are going to domains of ill repute, we shall call them, and they're doing it evenly, which means that owning an iOS device, and this is going to be sad news, doesn't make you smarter inherently than owning any other device out there. Okay? We saw some other things, and this is really, I think, a pointer to the community about how we're doing this analysis. So what we see here are two campaigns. And on the left side, we've got malware epsilon. On the right side, we've got beta. I'm not allowed to tell you what the names of these are, but I can tell you roughly what they do. So the one on the left steals your contact information. It sends out links via SMS. It tries to get other people to be infected as well, who are connected to you. The right, and I don't really understand the motivation for this, it's a fake front to a very, very popular streaming movie service. And its goal is to steal your credentials to that service. Now, I don't know about you all, but one set of credentials to a movie service should be enough. This one goes out and tries to steal as many as possible. So I guess you can watch all the Netflix movies you want all at the same time. But that's what it does. OK. And so what are these? Well, this is actually a global analysis of DNS. And what we do, we have global sensors deployed. And what we're seeing is how many visits are, or how many people are actually hitting these sites. What we can see is, very nicely, we've got this nice spike here. And wow, at any given time, almost 11,000 users for campaign Epsilon and 80,000 users for this other campaign beta. But what does that mean? Well, I'm going to show you something about when these were disclosed. It turns out that we saw this in the network back in March. It wasn't until October well after this campaign had died, that the mobile malware community came out and said, hey, guys, we did all this software analysis and we found a piece of mobile malware. There. The campaign had moved on and died. It had been shut down, abandoned, it was gone. Okay, so this approach of trying to chase after mobile malware after the fact is ridiculous, especially when we know that these servers are associated with known malicious campaigns historically. All right? By the way, in case you're interested, here is Class A index. So we're looking at the /8 on the y-axis. And what this shows is where these two campaigns are hosted. If you've ever done any kind of hosting, you know that for the most part, this should be very stable. Right? That you don't want your domain to be hopping around the IP address space. That's bad. This is actually a common sign of a botnet. And so you can see here that a domain that's hosted in all of these places, this one's a little more normal, but still not very good. A domain that's hosted in all of these places is with very high likelihood malicious. And again, we can see that way over here as opposed to October over here. That maybe if this is even a problem, we should be looking from the network perspective to shut it down, as opposed to writing yet another paper about how we found a few more pieces of malware in a market. OK, so what we did in the first half of the talk is we tried to measure the myth. And again, the bad news is, unfortunately, mobile malware does exist. Okay? And people are getting infected. But it's very, very uncommon. All right? Now, it turns out that both users of iOS and Android and everything else out there appear to be going to domains of ill repute with the same frequency, with the same likelihood, which means that no platform inherently makes you safer from visiting these domains. Okay? What happens when you go to these domains? We also don't know yet. So that's part of our current effort. It turns out if you're going to a domain that tries to get you to do a drive-by download of an x86 executable, how well do you think they're going to infect my ARM-enabled device? Right? I mean, who cares? We don't know the answer to that either, and that's something we're trying to find. But users seem to be going to these domains with the same regularity across platforms, and we really want to figure out why. Quite simply, mobile malware really isn't a threat that's affecting very many people right now. Right? But more critically, I showed you that number earlier, of the top 100 applications, all are taking some sort of personal information, at least 25% of which are taking GPS information about you. So in terms of answering that first question, where should we be spending our time against real versus perceived threats? It's very clear, the real threat is very clearly not mobile malware for the vast majority of users. Okay? All of those applications taking private information from your phone are a much more concrete and realistic threat. They're happening to almost every single one of you as we speak. Okay? So what other things can be done? What other problems are there in this space? What can we do to stop the existence of real problems? Well, I've done some work in this space of applications and the private information they take. A lot of people have too. So I want to try and introduce a slightly different area in which we've had some success. And that's this. So everyone knows. Who's given me a call here? That's right. I can tell by the chorus of responses that it's Jill. Good old Jill. I even have her picture on my phone. That's great. Okay. How does my phone know that it's Jill that's giving me a call? That's right. The phone sees a number that comes in, and it goes, I have an entry for that phone number. It relies on caller ID, and then does a lookup and puts the name there. So a few questions for you. Anybody ever get calls from these? Okay, unknown or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6?
Yes.
Okay, that's Skype. That's right. But what about this number? 1-800-432-1000. Now, probably not many of you here in Canada are using Bank of America. But if you were, and you got a call from this, it might pop up as Bank of America. In fact, I could go to their website and take a look and see that that really is Bank of America's phone number. Right? So, strong authentication, right? I know that I'm talking to Bank of America. Lots of fun examples of this, by the way. Okay? Turns out that telephony lacks any real source of a trusted authenticator. And one of my two favorite examples here. The first is, soon after we wrote this paper, I got a call from a bank, and they said, Dr. Traynor, we're so excited. You decided to finance your car through us. I know it's 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, but wow, this is great. We're so happy. Listen, we want to tell you about other services we have. So what I want you to do, though, first is tell me your Social Security number. Okay, in the US, that's a really important number. We're not supposed to give that out. I said, oh, slow down. How do I know who you are? She said, oh, you can trust your caller ID, right? Right, I'm from the bank. Long story short, she really got the wrong guy on the other end of the line because she got so frustrated with me. She's like, listen, I can prove that I'm the bank. I can tell you your Social Security number. See, I got her to the point where she was willing to tell me my own private information over the phone. I won't tell you which bank this was that was doing this, but I was horrified. I was horrified. Another great example, by the way, is I don't know if you get American Idol up here at all. Right? Well, it turns out that various laws in the United States require that caller ID is used as a strong authenticator to determine when a person is at a place. And one example is through healthcare. So if you're doing a home visit, HIPAA laws in the United States say that before you can talk about patient information, you have to be at that patient's home. Okay? So there was a woman who was caught abusing this system. What she was doing was she wasn't visiting anybody. She was just using caller ID. She'd spoof the caller ID and call up, bill hours, never show up, get a nice paycheck. It wasn't until they caught her auditioning for American Idol at the same time she was billing hours for being halfway across the country that they realized that, there's fraud going on here. Now, if I told you all how to do this, it's very, very simple. You can Google it. Okay, you can all get calling cards to do this. You can set up your own service. It's very, very easy. Within 5 minutes, yes, you too can become a caller ID scammer. And US financials are losing, it's about $1.5 billion through this vector every year. Okay? One of the common things that Zeus is now being used for, it's very interesting, the Zeus Botnet. It turns out that if I'm on my banking site and all of a sudden I move $10,000 to West Africa, the bank goes, Patrick, you don't usually move that money to West Africa. I'm going to put a hold on it, and I'm going to check. Right? And that is a real pain to the guys who are trying to steal money that way. So what they do is they put Zeus, they get it on your machine, they steal your private information, then they spoof your caller ID and call the bank, and they say, oh, yeah, I can answer this question. Oh, yeah, I can answer that question. Great. And off they go, and they move the money. Right? It happened over the phone. The bank will use the caller ID and go, well, they answered the questions, and the caller ID said it was the person, so it must be. Okay, and I'll tell you some things we've learned about this in the process. Why is this possible? Well, it turns out that the telephony landscape is fairly diverse. Right? Most of us have cell phones. A small number of us probably have these old PSTN traditional phones. An increasing number of us are using VoIP. And it turns out that caller ID is asserted but not attested metadata that sometimes passes across these networks. So I heard a chorus of, that's Skype, from over here. And oftentimes what Skype does is it just fills in random characters. Okay? Anytime my dad calls me on Skype, he lives in New Jersey, a random California number pops up, and I wonder why I'm getting calls from California. All right? The point, though, is, again, this is asserted but not attested data. That if I say my caller ID is this and it goes across one network interface to another, the other side goes, that's what you claimed. So yeah, that's probably your caller ID. Okay? It's very, very easy to spoof this. Now, part of me would like a very complete solution to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy crypto across all phones, and I'm going to have a PKI that works, and it's going to be great. All right, but I'm a systems guy, and I want this to be deployed. Okay, so what do we do? Well, we're going to come up with a solution that is one-sided. Only one party in this has to take part. The other part is party whether they want to or not. What we're going to do is we're going to propose a system called pin drop. And the idea is that the audio is the only thing we can guarantee that will end up at the endpoint. Okay, if you're making a video call and you're trying to do it to a landline, only the audio is going to get through. The metadata may or may not get through. Okay? So trying to attach and retrofit phones and make them capable of doing crypto, right? Think of a rotary phone, and plugging in some sort of crypto unit to it, boy, that's crazy. Right? The only thing that gets there is the audio. And it turns out that the audio tells a whole lot about where that call came from and how it got to you. Now, specifically, what we're doing is not biometric authentication of the user. But we want to know something about the phone from which it originated and then the path which it took. So here, for example, we have a call originating on a mobile phone. And it might pass through a mobile network, eventually into the PSTN. And then when it gets to the endpoint, it might have some set of features. For example, we might be able to tell if there was packet loss. Hey, if this was just a cellular-to-cellular call, it probably shouldn't have packet loss, right? We can tell things about the noise and the sound quality, and we can take all these things together, and we can first identify the networks that it went over. And second, we can develop signatures for specific people. All right, so I want to show you very briefly here just one feature. We have many, many features, but I want to illustrate how one works. So I'm going to play a little bit of audio, and I want you to listen carefully. The first piece of audio, none of the sentences really make sense, by the way, but just bear with me. The first piece of audio is perfect. There's no packet loss, so give it a listen.
Trample the spark, else the flames will spread. The hilt of the sword was carved with fine design.
OK. Now listen to that same stream of audio with 10% packet loss. Now I've added such a high packet loss here so that you can hear the difference.
Trample the spark, else the flames will spread. The hilt of the sword was carved with fine design.
Did everybody hear just those little variations, the flubs, the robotization of the voice? There are changes there, and it turns out that those changes are actually easily identifiable algorithmically. Okay, so for this example, we can look at something like the amplitude of the wave to tell us if packet loss exists and how often it occurs. So here we have standard amplitude of our signal. And it's hard to tell, but at this spot, and this spot, we have packet loss. If you go back to your early EE classes, we can do something called short-term energy transform. And it turns out that when we do this, whenever we have a packet loss, we have these effectively bottomless chasms. These places where the signal energy falls off entirely and then eventually comes back. But the cool thing about this is it's not enough just to say that a packet was lost, but the size of these chasms actually matter. Okay, it turns out that different codecs have different size packets. They encode a certain amount of audio in each one, and the loss of a packet is going to directly relate to how much audio is lost. So here we have a chasm that's 30 milliseconds, and that's representative of the codec ILBC. And then here we're using speaks, and that has 20 milliseconds, 20 millisecond wide chasms. So again, we can use methods like this not only to tell that packet loss is occurring, so that we're not coming through the PSTN or through the cellular network, and we can also tell what codec is being used. So we can very clearly tell you, look, this is a Google Voice number, this is a Skype number, this is where it's coming from. Now again, this is one of a huge, huge number of features. I just wanted to illustrate one. So what did we do? Well, we had friends as all over the world as we could. I don't want to obscure Australia here. And we had them call us from every single kind of phone that we possibly could. Right? Our home in Atlanta, we had people with PSTNs, cellular, Skype, Magic Jack, okay, my net phone, all sorts of different and interesting phone technologies. And what did he see? Well, if we have 10 samples, effectively with a single sample, uses our training set, with 90% accuracy, we could actually classify specifically who that fingerprint belonged to. And if we had 3 samples for each, we could get that up to 97.5. Right? We also learned a couple of interesting things. For example, it turns out that all 3 of these phones that are underlined here in red are in Atlanta. But these 2, GT1 and GT2, are actually 2 landline phones by the same manufacturer in the same lab, plugged in next to each other. And it turns out that defects in manufacturing also make themselves apparent. Right? So when you have that analog meets digital process, right, when somebody got in or a machine got in and actually soldered the microphone, those differences make themselves apparent. So the noise profile not only said, look, this was a landline, but it was this specific phone. All right, so now why should you care about a paper that showed up at CCS in 2010? Well, we took this idea and we did something with it. We thought it was actually pretty practical. And so we formed a company called Pin Drop Security. We did that in 2011. And since that time, we've received a number of awards. Again, if you're in the startup game, you can sort of measure the weight of how important these things are. But we are one of the top 10 most innovative startups at the RSA conference in 2012, the rookie security company of 2013. We have seed funding from the National Science Foundation, SBIR 1 and 2, and Andreessen Horowitz, the West Coast big venture fund behind Google and Facebook, are also helping head up our venture. We actually just did a Series A in Atlanta, and it was the largest Series A ever raised in Atlanta. We're actually, and this is the most exciting part, we're actually deploying this product in 4 of the top 10 largest financials in the US right now. And the biggest problem that we're having is we're able to identify fraud or fraudulent numbers at a much higher rate than they're used to. So in this industry, find that products that have about a 35 to a 40% rate in practice that's the norm. On all of our tests, we've been doing 90 to 91%. And so they're a little suspicious of why it actually works. What we're finding, though, is that through this deployment, we've found that there are actually 2 major campaigns. And through our work with law enforcement, we found that these campaigns are actually located in Tijuana, Mexico, and in West Africa, location not exactly known. And there are 2 effectively large boiler rooms that are being fed by the Zeus Botnet with all of this private information. And these guys are using a small number of VoIP services to make calls into the US and try and take money out of people's accounts and transfer it. We currently have 27 employees. So if you're looking for a job stateside, and you can do a little machine learning, and you're excited in the startup space, then let's chat afterwards. Okay, but the cool thing about this is this, that we took a simple idea that was a CCS paper, and academically it's very satisfying. We got to go back and relive all the glory days of our electrical engineering backgrounds. And then we turned it into that paper, which became a patent, which became a successful company. Hopefully you all are thinking about doing that too. So the conclusions are this. Okay? Look, telephony networks are, in my mind, one of the critical global systems. And I say that because if you agree that the internet's a big deal, at about 1.5 billion users, you'd be right. Okay? But with these systems, we're talking almost 5.5, 6 billion people rely on telephony networks. Right? These are the only digital systems that the vast majority of humanity will ever touch. When we think about how the internet will expand to the rest of the world in the next 5 to 10 years, it's through here. So hey, the security is important. Right? The threats here are varied, and so are their implications. We're only beginning to understand what they are. Okay, it turns out that the one that's the easiest to get behind, right? We've seen malware bad. Okay, we've seen malware in the desktop space. Those problems haven't translated directly to mobile. But what is, according to other researchers, something that is quite common is the theft of personal information. That's offered up by users for free services. Okay? Beware of the hype. Okay, I told you in the beginning that Bigfoot sightings in Ohio, while cute, were irrelevant because the data does not support it. What I'm saying here is we don't have evidence to support epidemic infection in these systems. We just don't have it. Okay? Alternatively, we focused our attention on other systems that need assistance. Caller ID spoofing, and we've been able to develop some pretty strong methods to help prevent attacks in that space. Okay? The right efforts tell us where to spend our time and efforts, and I hope that we've maybe shed some light on that for you. Okay? I do a bunch of other things at Georgia Tech. I'll give you a quick example. Do you all have an emergency alert system here that if the apocalypse comes, you're all supposed to get a text message? Okay? Yeah, and that's the problem. So basically, I worked with the providers a few years ago to say this is absolutely insane, and that it turns out that if I use a point-to-point system as a broadcast medium, it doesn't work. So I worked with the providers in the US and worked with standards bodies. This pushed back in the US the implementation of something called the WARN Act, which was written by Congress about how warnings were to be delivered. So my research actually pushed back the implementation of that by 3 years so that the providers could actually implement a standard that made sense in this case. And great, I got a nice journal paper out of it. Okay, we've done some work on security of mobile browsers. The upshot is generally bad. And we also have some fun. Okay, we had a paper a couple of years ago at CCS where we took a mobile phone and we put it beside a keyboard, and only using the accelerometers in that phone, we were able to determine what people were typing on the keyboard next to it. Okay, so we were just having fun with interfaces that weren't necessarily well controlled, and we showed it was a lot of work, but that it was technically possible. Tons of system stuff, privacy. We do lots of exciting things at Georgia Tech. I hope you'll come and visit us sometime. Again, my name is Patrick Traynor. Thank you so much. I'll take questions.
Questions for Patrick?
Yes?
How does the pin drop system prevent fraud?
Okay. The question was, how does the pin drop system prevent fraud? The way it's currently deployed is in call centers. And so what happens is when a call center picks up, we flash effectively. This is not the fingerprint. This is a different path, or this is the fingerprint of a known scammer. And we pass that up to the person in the call center, and whatever they do with it, they do with it.
So, but could I not record somebody's signature and then try?
Yeah. So that's the great thing is that it turns out that. If I want to talk to you over the phone network, or say over VoIP, I don't get to ask every ISP in the middle, hey, listen, could I have no packet loss on this connection? That would be really great. See, it turns out that the infrastructure doesn't allow for that. So unless you have absolute control of the infrastructure between you and I, it's really difficult. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question relating to the signatures of how the phone calls are made. So Google Voice you can have either on your phone or from a computer.
Yeah.
Did you make any kind of study or test whether they were in fact different signatures or were they the same?
Yeah. So it is very different. It is very different when you take a Google Voice call on your phone versus on your computer. So we've had to, in some cases, develop multiple profiles for individuals. We know, for example, sometimes if we can't get a strict fingerprint for who this is or who it matches, it's enough to say, look, this is a Google Voice call. This person has never called via Google Voice. Red flag. And oftentimes what the banks will do then is they say, we'll call you back. So then it becomes a policy decision of how you deal with this red flag. Yeah. Sorry, the question effectively was, how do you deal with phones that might have multiple methods of calling? Specifically Google Voice. Yes?
Going back to the first work, I guess we weren't able to differentiate between the apps that were making the requests towards those websites, right? So I guess,
yeah.
I mean, it's one thing, I guess, for someone to click on a phishing email link, and another to use an app that's actually interacts with Google.
I agree. And so the point was, based on DNS only, you can't tell whether it's an app or whether it is somebody doing it on their browser, and that's absolutely true. So one of the things we tried to do was, again, get the largest collection of mobile malware, crack it open, see what it was actually doing. If the user happened to type that in to their browser, that would be it'd be a false positive for infection. But as you can see, with the numbers as low as they are, even then that would be very, very low. Yes?
So to your understanding, is it actually a prevalent situation where the malware, where the community only becomes aware of the malware months after it happens, like in one of these cases?
So the question was, is it really a problem if the community only becomes aware of it months later? And I think the answer is yes. So if you argue that, look, infection can happen, and we saw in these cases, both of those campaigns that I showed, those were campaigns that had happened in mobile and desktop at the same time. So that's why we got that big splash, by the way. The traffic was all coming from desktop machines that were related to that campaign, but they weren't sending SMSs to get the information. So in this case, what we showed was, look, if you look at the hosting profile, you can see that this is extremely likely to be malicious very early. Why on earth would an application that's submitted be hitting this, this part of the address space? Why would we wait around for someone to go, that's malicious? As soon as that's submitted, should be able to knock it out. Okay, so the network offers us a way to look at maliciousness that I think we're missing in software. Right? That obfuscation and so forth might make it difficult to see. Yes?
This may be a naive question, but through your research, have you seen the inverse threat that you can call the bank and then the call goes somewhere else?
Yeah, so there's another threat that, that we're looking at, and that is it turns out that most of your voicemail accounts don't have a password or a PIN, or they're the last 4 digits of your phone number. And so what you can do oftentimes through those is then redirect phone calls. So calls that are supposed to come in for you actually get delivered to me, and then I can pretend to be you. So that will sound very different than it would if it was really you answering the phone. Again, one of the things that we did, by the way, we had students in India. Their parents were actually in India. And we had, for some of our test cases, mother picked up the phone, father picked up the phone. We weren't looking at who the speaker was. We wanted to know what the device was, what the path was. And so it was speaker agnostic.
So PIN drop can instead calls originating from the call center to other places as well? Not just
Well, let me put it this way. In terms of our current commercial offerings, there's only one, and that is really the call center deployment. We have grand plans, of course, to hopefully roll this out so that it's an app that can run on your phone, but maybe that's why we need to hire you. We don't have that right now. Right now, we're trying to protect the place where the money actually is. Great question. Yeah?
I'm not a computer scientist, so this might be really obvious, but you can differentiate between voice over IP calls from different services?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do you do that?
So the question was, can we really differentiate between voice over IP calls from different services? And we actually learned some very cool things. Do you all know what Vonage is? Okay, Vonage is a popular voice over IP service. And when we started studying the calls from Vonage, we had real problems because Vonage is VoIP, and all the calls made within the US were perfect. There was not a single packet dropped, and we couldn't figure out why. But the second we made a Vonage call internationally, boy, the quality just fell through the floor. What we ended up doing was we ended up reading their investor documents, and it turns out that what Vonage does is at the first hop possible, it actually pushes your call into the PSTN, and then it travels AT&T's network or Sprint or whomever, and then is delivered at the other end. So the quality is very high. That is very different from Google Voice, say. The quality of those calls is much lower. And again, because of the different codecs, you can say, look, this is Google Voice, this is Skype, and so forth. So we learned some very distinguishing characteristics about each of the big providers in terms of VoIP. Yeah. I'm just out of time here, so please do me a favor. Please come down and assault me verbally for the next few minutes. I'd love to get more questions. But again, I'm Patrick Traynor, and it's been a real pleasure being here today. Thank you very much.